Do you know what keeps a priest awake at night? It's not sin. It's not temptation. It's the 7 contradictions in Scripture so glaring, so impossible to explain, that 2,000 years of theology haven't been able to fix them. And the worst part? You were never supposed to notice. Right now, in Vatican archives, in seminary textbooks, in private theological debates, religious scholars know these problems exist. They've known for centuries. But they made a choice. They decided you didn't need to know. They decided it was better to let you keep believing, keep tithing, keep obeying, than to admit the truth. That choice wasn't about protecting your faith. It was about protecting their authority. I'm going to show you 7 lies embedded in the Bible itself. Not interpretations you can argue about. Not mysteries you're supposed to accept on faith. These are contradictions so obvious, so mathematically impossible, so historically false, that once you see them, you can't unsee them. And the church knows it. That's why they never mention them from the pulpit. That's why your Sunday school teacher skipped over them. That's why when you ask about them, you get silence or deflection or anger, but never a real answer. In 1670, a Jewish philosopher named Baruch Spinoza published a book that got him excommunicated, hunted, and erased from history. His crime? He read the Bible the way you'd read any other book. He asked simple questions. He noticed things that didn't add up. He refused to pretend contradictions were mysteries. And what he found was so dangerous that the Church spent 3 centuries trying to bury it. Spinoza discovered that the Bible you were taught to worship as the perfect inerrant Word of God is full of errors, not small mistakes, not scribal typos, major, fundamental, impossible problems that prove beyond any doubt that human hands didn't just copy these texts. They invented them, they altered them, they lied. And here's what the Church will never tell you. Every single one of these problems was known to the men who compiled the Bible. They saw the contradictions. They knew the timeline didn't work. They understood that some of these stories were impossible. But they included them anyway. Why? Because the lie was more useful than the truth. Because a population that believes impossible things will obey impossible demands. This isn't a video for people who want comfort. If you came here looking for reassurance that everything you were taught is true, you're in the wrong place. This is for the people who felt that nagging doubt in the back of their mind during communion. The people who asked questions as children and were told to stop thinking so much. The people who have sensed, somewhere deep, that the story doesn't quite hold together. If that's you, what I'm about to show you will change everything. Not because I'm going to give you new information, but because I'm going to show you what was always there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for you to look closely enough to see it. By the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why the Church can't explain these 7 lies. You're going to see the mechanism of control that's kept billions of people obedient for 2 millennia. And you're going to realize that the doubt you've been carrying, the guilt you've been feeling for questioning, wasn't weakness. It was intelligence trying to break through. Here's what I need from you right now. If you've ever sat in a pew and felt like something wasn't right, type the word awake in the comments. Not for me, for yourself. Because what we're about to do together requires you to be fully present. It requires you to set aside everything you were taught to believe without question and look at what's actually written in the book they told you was sacred. And I promise you, once you see it, there's no going back. Let me take you back to Amsterdam, 1656. Baruch Spinoza was 23 years old when the leaders of his own Jewish community gathered in the synagogue to pronounce a curse on him. Not a metaphorical curse. An actual, formal, ritualized condemnation that wished upon him every plague described in the Torah. They declared that he should be cursed by day and cursed by night, cursed when he lies down and cursed when he rises up, cursed when he goes out and cursed when he comes in. They forbade anyone from speaking to him, doing business with him, reading anything he wrote, or coming within 4 cubits of his body. What had this young man done to deserve this? He asked questions. He read the Torah, the same texts he'd been studying since childhood, and he noticed things that didn't make sense. He pointed out contradictions. He observed that Moses couldn't have written about his own death. He recognized that the language and style of different books suggested different authors from different time periods. He dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, these texts weren't dictated by God to perfect scribes, but were written by human beings with human agendas. For this honesty, his own people tried to erase him from existence. But Spinoza didn't stop. He couldn't. Because once you see a lie, you can't pretend it's the truth. He spent the rest of his short life grinding lenses to survive and writing in secret, developing a method that would eventually destroy the foundation of religious authority. His method was devastatingly simple. Read the text as it is, not as you wish it were. When you find a contradiction, don't make excuses for it. When you find an impossibility, don't call it a mystery. When you find evidence of human authorship, don't pretend it's divine. He applied this method to the Bible systematically, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And what he found was a book full of fingerprints, human fingerprints, editors who combined different versions of the same story and left both versions in, writers who accidentally revealed they were writing centuries after the events they described, copyists who made mistakes and then tried to fix them, creating new contradictions in the process. The religious authorities of his time understood immediately what this meant. If the Bible was written by humans, it could be questioned. If it could be questioned, it could be wrong. If it could be wrong, then the entire structure of religious authority, which claimed to speak for an infallible God through an infallible book, collapsed. So they did what authorities always do when confronted with truth that threatens their power. They attacked the messenger. They burned his books. They made sure his name became synonymous with heresy and atheism. But here's what they couldn't do. They couldn't answer his questions. They couldn't explain away the contradictions he found. They couldn't make the problems disappear. And 350 years later, they still can't. Because Spinoza wasn't wrong. He was right. And the evidence is still there, in the book they ask you to read every Sunday, waiting for anyone brave enough to look. Let me show you what he saw. Let me show you what they've been hiding. The first lie is so fundamental, so obvious once you see it, that you'll wonder how you ever missed it. It's right there in the beginning. Genesis, the creation story. You know it by heart, don't you? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Darkness covered the deep. God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Day 1. Then he separated the waters, made the sky. Day 2. Then dry land and vegetation. Day 3. Then the sun and moon and stars. Day 4. Wait. Stop right there. Read that again. On day 3, God creates plants. On day 4, God creates the sun. Do you see the problem? Plants need sunlight to survive. They need it for photosynthesis, the basic process that keeps them alive. But according to Genesis, plants existed for a full day before the sun existed. How did they photosynthesize? How did they survive? The text doesn't say. It doesn't even acknowledge the problem. Now, you might be thinking, well, God could have provided light some other way. He created light on day 1 before the sun. Maybe that was enough, but that doesn't solve the problem. It creates a bigger one. If God created light on day 1 that was sufficient for plant life, why did he need to create the sun on day 4? What purpose does the sun serve if light already existed independently? And if the light from day 1 wasn't sufficient for plants, then the plants couldn't have survived day 3. This isn't a mystery. This isn't something deep that requires faith to understand. This is a simple, logical impossibility. Either the story is wrong, or the laws of nature are wrong. And we know the laws of nature aren't wrong, because every plant you've ever seen requires sunlight. Spinoza looked at this and asked a question that seems obvious now, but was revolutionary then. What if this contradiction exists because 2 different creation stories got combined into one? What if one ancient text had God creating light first, and another had God creating the sun first, and when someone tried to merge them, they created this impossible sequence? And that's exactly what happened. If you keep reading Genesis, you'll find a second creation story that starts in chapter 2, verse 4. It has a completely different order of events. In this version, God creates man first, then plants, then animals, then woman. It's the reverse of the order in chapter 1, where plants come first, then animals, then man and woman together. 2 different stories, 2 different sequences, both included in the same book, both supposedly written by the same divine author who can't seem to remember what order he created things in. The Church knows about this. Biblical scholars have known about the 2 creation accounts for over a century. They have names for the different source texts. They call one the priestly source and the other the Jahwist source. They can show you exactly where one ends and the other begins. They teach this in seminary, but they don't teach it to you. They let you keep thinking it's one continuous, perfect, divinely inspired account. Because if you knew it was 2 contradictory human stories stitched together, you might start asking what else in the Bible is stitched together. You might start questioning the whole thing. And they can't have that. The second lie is even more shocking because it involves one of the most famous stories in the entire Bible, Noah and the flood. You know this one too. God sees that humanity has become wicked. He decides to destroy everything with a flood. He tells Noah to build an ark and fill it with 2 of every animal, male and female, to preserve life. Noah obeys. The flood comes. Everything dies except Noah, his family, and the animals on the ark. The waters recede. Noah releases the animals to repopulate the earth. Beautiful story. Powerful message about judgment and salvation and new beginnings. Except it's not one story. It's 2 stories badly combined, and the seams are showing everywhere. Genesis chapter 6, verse 19, says God told Noah to bring 2 of every animal onto the ark. Chapter 7, verse 2, says God told Noah to bring 7 pairs of every clean animal and 1 pair of every unclean animal. That's not a small difference. That's not a detail you misremember. That's a fundamental contradiction about the central action of the story. Did Noah bring 2 of each, or did he bring 14 of some and 2 of others? The text gives you both answers. In the same book. Sometimes in the same chapter. Because 2 different versions of the flood story got merged together, and whoever did the merging didn't bother to fix the contradictions. They just included both versions, assuming no one would read closely enough to notice. But it gets worse. Genesis 7, verse 12 says, "The rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights." Genesis 7, verse 24 says, "The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. Which is it, 40 or 150? The text says both. It contradicts itself within a few verses. Then there's the question of how long Noah stayed on the ark. If you add up all the time references in the text carefully, you get different totals depending on which verses you include. Some calculations give you just over a year. Others give you much less. The text is inconsistent with itself because it's preserving two different versions of how long the flood lasted. And here's where it gets really interesting. Ancient Mesopotamian cultures had flood stories centuries before Genesis was written. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the Bible by at least 1,000 years, tells the story of a man named Utnapishtim, who builds a boat to survive a flood sent by the gods. The parallels are unmistakable. A righteous man, divine warning, a boat, animals preserved, a bird sent out to find dry land, a sacrifice after the flood. The structure is identical. Did the biblical authors copy from Gilgamesh? Not directly, but they clearly drew from the same ancient Near Eastern tradition of flood mythology. And when you understand that, the contradictions make perfect sense. Different communities had different versions of the flood story. When someone tried to create one definitive version for the Bible, they included elements from multiple sources. They combined them imperfectly, and they left the evidence of that combination right there in the text. The church doesn't want you to know this. They don't want you to know that the flood story has a pre-biblical pagan origin. They don't want you to notice the internal contradictions. They want you to think it's a simple, historical, divinely revealed account of a real event. Because if you knew it was a composite text based on older myths, you'd start wondering what else in the Bible has pagan origins. You'd start realizing that these stories weren't revealed by God. They were inherited from surrounding cultures and adapted to fit a new theological framework. And once you see that, the whole idea of biblical inerrancy collapses. The third lie involves the 10 Commandments. You know them. You've probably seen them posted in courthouses, printed on posters, memorized in Sunday school. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not commit adultery. The foundation of Judeo-Christian morality. The laws God Himself wrote on stone tablets and gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. Except God gave Moses the 10 Commandments twice, and they're not the same both times. In Exodus chapter 20, God speaks the 10 Commandments to the people directly from the mountain. Then Moses goes up to receive them written on stone tablets. But in Exodus chapter 32, Moses comes down and finds the people worshiping a golden calf. In his anger, he smashes the tablets. So in Exodus chapter 34, God tells Moses to cut new tablets, and God will write the commandments again. But when you read what God writes the second time in Exodus 34, it's not the same list at all. The second version includes commandments about not cooking a young goat in its mother's milk, about celebrating specific festivals, about offering the firstborn of your livestock. These aren't the famous 10 Commandments. These are ritual laws about sacrifice and festival observance, and yet the text specifically calls them the 10 Commandments, and says God wrote them on the tablets. So which set is the real 10 Commandments? The ones in Exodus 20 that you memorized, or the ones in Exodus 34 that are actually called the 10 Commandments in the text, and are actually described as being written on the tablets? You can't have it both ways. Either the famous moral laws are the 10 Commandments, but they were never actually written on the tablets. Or the ritual laws are the 10 Commandments, because they're what the text says was written on the tablets. Either way, the story you were taught isn't accurate. And there's more. Deuteronomy chapter 5 gives another version of the 10 Commandments. It's mostly the same as Exodus 20, but with key differences. The Sabbath commandment has a completely different justification. In Exodus, you're supposed to rest on the Sabbath because God rested after creation. In Deuteronomy, you're supposed to rest because you were slaves in Egypt and God freed you. Same commandment. Two different reasons, both supposedly spoken by the same God. Why would God give different reasons for the same law? He wouldn't. But different human authors writing at different times with different theological priorities would absolutely give different reasons. One author emphasized creation theology. Another emphasized liberation theology. When their texts were combined, both versions stayed in. And now you have a Bible that contradicts itself about why you should observe the Sabbath. Spinoza saw this and understood immediately what it meant. The 10 Commandments weren't revealed once, perfectly, divinely. They were developed over time by different communities with different concerns. The laws evolved, the justifications changed, and when later editors tried to create one authoritative version, they included multiple traditions, creating a text that tells the same story 3 different ways with 3 different sets of details. The Church can't explain this. They can acknowledge that there are different versions in different books. They can say that Deuteronomy is Moses retelling the story, so naturally some details changed. But that doesn't explain why God would give different reasons for the same commandment. It doesn't explain why the second set of tablets in Exodus 34 has completely different content. It doesn't explain why a supposedly perfect revelation needs 3 different versions. The only explanation that makes sense is the one Spinoza gave. These texts weren't revealed. They were written by humans who had different ideas about what the laws should be and why they mattered. And the contradictions are proof. The 4th lie is about Moses himself, the man who received the law, who led the Israelites out of Egypt, who spoke with God face to face. The hero of the Exodus story. According to the Bible, Moses wrote the first 5 books of Scripture: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Torah, the foundation of everything. But Moses didn't write the Torah. And we know this with absolute certainty because the Torah describes Moses' death. Deuteronomy chapter 34 describes Moses going up to Mount Nebo, seeing the promised land from a distance, dying, and being buried in an unmarked grave in Moab. It says no one knows where his grave is to this day. It says Moses was 120 years old when he died, but his eyes were not dim and his vigor had not abated. It says the people mourned for 30 days. It even says there has never been another prophet like Moses in Israel since. How did Moses write about his own death? How did he write that no one has been like him since? How did he write to this day about events that happened after he died? He didn't. Someone else wrote this. Someone who lived after Moses. Someone who was looking back on Moses' life from a distance and making historical claims about his uniqueness. This isn't speculation. This is simple logic. If a text describes events that happened after the supposed author died, then the supposed author didn't write it. Someone else did. And it's not just the ending. Throughout the Torah, there are phrases that only make sense if written by someone living much later. The text repeatedly says things like, "In those days, the Canaanites were in the land," implying that at the time of writing, they were no longer in the land. But Moses lived during the time when Canaanites were still in the land. He wouldn't write as if they were a thing of the past. The text refers to the land east of the Jordan as beyond the Jordan, which is the perspective of someone living west of the Jordan in Canaan. But Moses died east of the Jordan. He never crossed over. He wouldn't describe the east side as beyond, because for him, that was this side. There are place names in the Torah that didn't exist in Moses' time. There are references to kings and kingdoms that didn't exist until centuries later. There are linguistic features that belong to later periods of Hebrew. Every single one of these is a fingerprint, evidence that whoever wrote these texts lived long after Moses, looking back on events from a distance, sometimes making mistakes about details, because so much time had passed. Spinoza catalogued these anachronisms methodically. He showed that the Torah couldn't have been written by Moses. He argued it was compiled much later from older sources, edited together by someone who preserved different traditions even when they contradicted each other. And he was right. Modern biblical scholarship has confirmed everything he said. We can now identify multiple source documents woven together in the Torah. We can see where editors combined them. We can even sometimes catch the editors making mistakes, leaving verses in the wrong order or creating contradictions by imperfect splicing. The Church knows all of this. It's taught in every accredited seminary. But they don't teach it to you. Because if you knew Moses didn't write the Torah, you'd start asking who did. And when you found out it was compiled centuries later by anonymous editors using sources of varying reliability, you'd realize the whole idea of divine authorship is fiction. You'd understand that these texts have authority because the Church says they do, not because God wrote them, and that's a truth they can't afford for you to know. The fifth lie is hidden in one of the most disturbing commands in the entire Bible. In the book of Joshua, after the Israelites cross the Jordan and begin conquering Canaan, God commands them to commit genocide, not just military conquest, total annihilation. Men, women, children, infants, livestock, everything that breathes. Joshua chapter 6 describes the fall of Jericho. After the walls collapse, the text says the Israelites devoted everything in the city to destruction. They killed everyone except Rahab and her family. Joshua chapter 10 describes 5 cities conquered in a single day, and in each one Joshua struck down every person, leaving no survivors, just as God commanded. The phrase shows up again and again. Leave no survivors. Kill everything that breathes. Devote them to destruction. This isn't presented as a war crime. It's presented as obedience to God's direct command. God himself is portrayed as ordering the extermination of entire populations, including children. Now, there are 2 possibilities here. Either this actually happened, in which case the God of the Bible commanded and approved of genocide, including the murder of infants. Or it didn't happen, in which case the Bible is lying about history and falsely attributing genocidal commands to God. For centuries, the Church chose option 1. They said, yes, God commanded it, and it was righteous because these people were wicked, and God has the right to judge. They built entire theological systems to justify why it's okay for God to order the killing of children. They taught that sometimes love requires violence, that God's ways are higher than our ways, that we shouldn't question divine commands even when they seem monstrous to us. But here's what they didn't tell you. Archaeological evidence shows it never happened. We've excavated the sites of these supposedly destroyed cities. We've analyzed the layers of occupation. And what we find is that there was no sudden, violent conquest in the 13th or 12th century BCE when Joshua supposedly lived. The cities either weren't occupied at the time or showed no evidence of destruction, or were destroyed centuries earlier or later by different peoples. Jericho, the first city conquered in Joshua's campaign, wasn't even occupied during the late Bronze Age when the Exodus supposedly happened. The walls weren't standing. There was no city there to conquer. The archaeological record is clear on this. The conquest described in Joshua is not historical, so the genocide never happened. But that creates an even bigger problem. If it never happened, why does the Bible say it did? Why does the text portray God as commanding something so horrific if he never actually commanded it? Who invented these stories, and why did they put genocidal commands in God's mouth? The answer is that the book of Joshua was written centuries after the supposed events, during a time when the Israelites were trying to establish a national identity and religious purity. They were surrounded by other cultures, other religions, other ways of life, and the authors of Joshua wanted to send a message: total separation, total devotion to Yahweh alone, no compromise, no tolerance, no mixing. So they invented stories about the past where their ancestors were commanded to completely destroy everyone who wasn't part of their group. These stories weren't history. They were propaganda. They were meant to inspire 7th or 6th century BCE Israelites to maintain strict boundaries, to refuse intermarriage, to reject foreign gods. The genocidal commands were theological fiction designed to promote ethnic and religious purity. But the Church can't admit that. Because if Joshua is theological fiction, what else is? If these commands were invented by human authors pursuing a political agenda rather than revealed by God, then the entire foundation of biblical authority crumbles. You can't claim the Bible is God's inerrant word if it contains invented genocidal commands falsely attributed to God. So instead, they do something even more disturbing. They defend the genocide. They argue that God had the right to command it. They construct elaborate justifications for why it was moral to kill children if God said so. They twist themselves into moral pretzels rather than admit the simple truth that Spinoza saw immediately. These stories were written by humans, flawed humans, humans with tribal prejudices and violent imaginations, humans who projected their own brutality onto God and called it holy. The sixth lie appears in the prophets, and it's one that Jesus himself relied on: the prophecy of the virgin birth. You know the story. Isaiah 7:14 says, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." Christians have used this verse for 2,000 years to prove that Jesus' birth was predicted centuries in advance. A virgin conception. A son called Emmanuel, which means God with us. It's right there in the Old Testament, they say. Proof that Jesus is the Messiah. Except Isaiah never said virgin. The Hebrew word in Isaiah 7:14 is alma, which means young woman. Not virgin, just young woman. There's a different Hebrew word for virgin, betula, and Isaiah didn't use it. He used alma. A young woman shall conceive, which is not a miracle. It's what young women do. They grow up, get married, and have children. So how did virgin get into the text? Through translation error. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek around 200 BCE, the translators used the Greek word parthenos, which can mean virgin, and when the Gospel writers, who were working from Greek texts, read parthenos, they interpreted it as virgin and built their birth narrative around it. But if you go back to the Hebrew original, there's no virgin birth prophecy. There's just a young woman having a baby. And if you read the context of Isaiah 7, it's not even about the distant future. It's about Isaiah's own time. King Ahaz is worried about enemy armies. Isaiah tells him not to fear and gives him a sign. A young woman, probably Isaiah's own wife or someone present at the time, is going to have a baby. And before that child is old enough to know right from wrong, the threat will be over. It's a sign about immediate political events, not about a Messiah 500 years in the future. The virgin birth prophecy doesn't exist. It's based on a mistranslation that was then reinterpreted as messianic centuries later. Jesus wasn't fulfilling prophecy. The Gospel writers were retrofitting Hebrew scripture to fit their theological needs, sometimes mistranslating in the process. And the Church knows this. Hebrew scholars know what Alma means. They know Isaiah 7 isn't about Jesus. They know it's a mistranslation, but they keep teaching it as prophecy anyway, because if they admitted this foundational proof text is based on an error. What does that do to the claim that Jesus fulfilled prophecy? What does it do to the entire structure of Christian apologetics that relies on Old Testament predictions of Christ? It destroys it, So they keep the lie alive. They keep translating Alma as virgin, even though it's wrong. They keep pretending Isaiah was talking about Jesus, even though the context makes that impossible. They protect the doctrine by distorting the text. Spinoza caught this. He read Hebrew. He knew what the words actually meant. He pointed out that Christian interpreters were forcing meanings onto Hebrew texts that the original authors never intended. And for saying this, for simply noting what the Hebrew actually says, he was branded a heretic. The seventh lie is the most personal. It's about you, about what they told you about yourself, about the fundamental nature of who you are. The church taught you that you were born broken, born sinful, born carrying the guilt of Adam's disobedience. They taught you that from the moment you took your first breath, you deserved punishment. That without divine intervention, without accepting the right doctrine and performing the right rituals, you were condemned. Not because of anything you did, but because of what you are, human. This doctrine, original sin, isn't in the Old Testament. You won't find it in Genesis. The story of Adam and Eve doesn't say that their sin was inherited by all their descendants. It doesn't say babies are born guilty. That interpretation was invented much later, primarily by Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, and it's based on a misreading of Paul's letters. But here's the lie underneath the lie. The idea that you're fundamentally broken, that you need salvation from outside yourself, that you can't be good or whole or acceptable without institutional religion mediating between you and God, this idea isn't theology. It's control. It's the mechanism by which the church makes you dependent. Think about it. If you're born broken and only the church has the fix, you need the church. If you're born guilty and only their rituals can cleanse you, you need their rituals. If you're born damned and only their doctrine can save you, you need their doctrine. The whole system is designed to create a problem that only they can solve. And the problem is you. You were taught to hate yourself, to see yourself as fallen, corrupt, shameful, worthy of eternal torture. And then they offered you relief from the very shame they created. They gave you rules to follow, prayers to recite, confessions to make, sacraments to receive, and if you did all of it correctly, maybe you could escape the punishment you deserved for being born. This is spiritual abuse. This is psychological manipulation on a civilizational scale. And the worst part is that it works. It worked on you, didn't it? How many years did you spend feeling guilty for thoughts you couldn't control? How many nights did you lie awake afraid you weren't good enough? How many times did you perform rituals not out of love, but out of fear, trying to earn approval from a God who'd been presented to you as perpetually disappointed? Spinoza rejected all of it. He said, "You're not broken. You're not born guilty. You don't need an institution to mediate your relationship with the divine. You are a part of nature, and nature is a part of God, and there's nothing shameful or fallen or wrong about that. Virtue isn't obedience to external rules. It's living in accordance with your own nature, using your reason, developing your capacities, finding joy and meaning in existence itself." For saying this, for offering liberation from religious guilt, he was called an atheist. But he wasn't denying God. He was denying the church's monopoly on God. He was saying, you don't need them. You never did. And that's the lie they can't forgive. The lie that you need saving from yourself. The lie that you're born bad and made good only through their intervention. That lie is the foundation of their power. Without it, you're free. With it, you're theirs. Now you've seen all seven. The creation contradiction, the flood inconsistencies, The multiple versions of the Ten Commandments, the impossibility of Mosaic authorship, the fictional genocide, the mistranslated prophecy, the manufactured shame, 7 lies, 7 clear, demonstrable, undeniable problems that the Church has known about for centuries and has never been able to explain. They can't explain them because explaining them would require admitting the truth, that the Bible is a human book, written by humans, edited by humans, full of human errors, human agendas, human fingerprints, and if it's a human book, it doesn't have divine authority. If it doesn't have divine authority, then the Church doesn't have divine authority. If the Church doesn't have divine authority, then you don't have to obey them. You don't have to believe them. You don't have to let them define reality for you. This is what Spinoza understood. This is what got him excommunicated. Not because he was wrong, but because he was right, and his rightness was dangerous. The Church can't explain these 7 lies, but I can. They exist because the Bible is exactly what it appears to be when you read it honestly. A collection of texts from different authors, different time periods, different communities, all trying to make sense of the divine in their own contexts. Some of what they wrote was beautiful. Some was profound. Some was wrong. Some was borrowed from other cultures. Some was invented to serve political purposes. It's a library, not a letter. A conversation across centuries, not a monologue from heaven. And here's what that means for you. Everything you were taught to feel guilty about. Question. Every rule you were told came directly from God. Investigate. Every doctrine that made you feel small, or broken, or unworthy, reject. You have the right to read these texts critically. You have the right to notice contradictions. You have the right to say, this doesn't make sense, and refuse to pretend it does. The doubt you've been carrying isn't rebellion. It's intelligence. The questions you've been afraid to ask aren't sin. They're courage. The guilt you've been feeling for thinking isn't conviction. It's conditioning. And you can break it. You don't have to choose between spirituality and honesty. You don't have to sacrifice your mind to keep your soul. You can believe in the divine without believing in institutions that claim to own it. You can find meaning without submitting to doctrines that contradict themselves. You can be good without believing you're bad. Spinoza paid everything to tell you this: his community, his reputation, his safety. He lived in isolation and died young, knowing his books were banned and his name was cursed. But he wrote anyway, because he believed truth mattered more than comfort. Freedom mattered more than acceptance. And your right to think for yourself mattered more than the Church's right to control what you think. 350 years later, his message is the same. You are not broken. You are not born guilty. You don't need permission to question. You don't need forgiveness for doubting. You need courage to trust what you've always known deep down. Something didn't add up. The story had holes. The logic was broken. You weren't wrong to notice. You were right. You've always been right. And now you know why they could never explain it. Because there is no explanation that preserves the lie. The only explanation that makes sense is the truth. And the truth is, they lied to you. Not about small things, about everything, about the book, about God, about you. But lies only work if you keep believing them. And you don't have to. Not anymore. If this gave you even a moment of freedom from guilt you've carried for years, don't keep it to yourself. Someone in your life is still trapped in the same prison you just walked out of. Share this. Not because I need you to. Because they need you to. Let this truth travel. Let it reach the people who are ready for it. Let it do for them what it just did for you. And if you want to keep going deeper, if you want to see what else Spinoza uncovered, what other lies are waiting to be exposed, stay here. Because this channel exists for one reason: to finish what he started, to give you back the freedom they took from you, to show you that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is always better than a comfortable lie. You came here with questions. You're leaving with answers. The only question now is what you're going to do with them.